So today we're going to talk about the Constitution specifically. American history and American government are very closely tied because we form this new type of government. So you have to understand the Constitution to understand American history. We're going to be looking at the Constitution in context as we move through the course, right? It's going to come back to a lot of stuff that has to do with the Constitution, even though we're not talking about it directly. So before we start U.S. history, we want to make sure that you understand this critical document, this document that sort of everything sort of pivots around. It's in the background, right? It's running in the background, but if you don't understand how it works and what it is, you might get lost. So let's talk about the U.S. history, the U.S. Constitution. These are two links. You can use both of these to access the U.S. Constitution. I would suggest reading the Constitution. If you haven't had a government class, you definitely want to spend some time here because there will be questions about the Constitution on the end of course exam. And then, of course, as we move through the course, it's going to come up in context as it relates to U.S. history. So, what is the Constitution? The U.S. Constitution describes how American government works. Don't get it confused with things like the Articles of the Confederation or the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution is the framework for government. It's going to set up that separation of powers and that checks and balances that's so unique to American government. The U.S. Constitution starts off with what's called the preamble. The preamble is a fancy way of saying the introduction. And the introduction to the Constitution is laying out why we need it. Remember that it's not our first attempt at government. We had the Articles of the Confederation. This is our second try. And it's sort of defending itself, but it's also acting as a thesis. It's saying, okay, everything that comes after, this is what we're trying to do. So it says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So the Founding Fathers fought this war to get away from the tyrant King George, right? And they're going to set up this new type of government. And these are the reasons why. This is why we need it. And so as we move through U.S. history, it's always going to come back to, well, how do you keep the United States together? How do you preserve the Union during the Civil War? How do we promote the general welfare if there's a conflict between conservatives and liberals? How do we deal with war, like World War II and World War One? It all comes back to this. So the preamble sort of lays it out, what the Constitution is trying to achieve. The Constitution is organized really nicely. It's organized by articles. Articles just group the things together, sort of like paragraphs. So Article 1 is going to describe the legislative branch. Remember, there are 3 branches to the U.S. government. The legislative branch is described in Article 1. It is the longest of the articles. It's the most in-depth of the articles. Because the founders thought that the legislative branch should have the most power because it is the branch that makes the laws. The legislative branch has 2 houses. That's where we get your House of Representatives, which is based on population, and then that's where you get your Senate, where every state gets 2 senators. So make sure that you understand the general structure of the legislative branch and understand what it does. Historical context. As we move through the course, we're going to talk about the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise gave us 2 plans. It gave us the Virginia Plan and the Jersey Plan, and they came together and gave us Congress. So we're going to be talking about the legislative branch as we move through the course. Article 2, the executive branch. This is probably the branch you're most familiar with. This is the president. The president is the one that enforces the laws. The president cannot make the laws. This is where that separation of power comes in. He can plead, he can negotiate, but he can't actually make the laws. So, of course, as we move through the course, we're going to be talking about all the different presidents and how they operated inside of this role. Article 3, this is the legislative branch. The legislative branch is made up of the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the United States. It interprets the laws. Doesn't make them, doesn't enforce them. It just looks at them and reads them and says how justice should be applied. We're going to talk about judicial review a lot in this course, how the Supreme Court has gained a lot of power, even though if you look at Article 3 and read Article 3, it's very short, and actually the Founding Fathers did not give this particular branch a lot of roles and a lot of power, but through judicial review has developed a great deal of power. So we'll look at specific court cases throughout the course. Marbury versus Madison, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Education. These are just a few of the court cases that we'll look at. And they get all of this, all of their power originating from Article 3 of the Constitution. So make sure that you know what each article of the Constitution is about. Make sure that you know things like separation of powers, balance of powers. Make sure you know who your senators are. That, of course, changes, so you'll need to look that up. Make sure you know who your House members are. You will need to know about the Constitution to set a firm basis for U.S. history.